I wasn't saved, I was radically saved. We would break out the bong and we would put crushed ice in, pour wine, smoke hash, you name it. I've done it. I had a doorknob talk to me one time. And then Pat was after me to come to church. It's like somebody turned off all the lights and a spotlight was shining on me, and God was saying, Randy Shipman, this is for you. And I gave my life to Jesus Christ that night. As I got to know her, I found out that she had, living with her, 21 kids. This is crazy. And I'm like, God, are you sure? And God said, yeah, Randy, I'm pretty sure. We opened up 3 group homes. My wife Sharon and I, together we have 7 kids. We adopted 14 and we have 2 other kids that they're our kids. My name's Randy Shipman, and I got saved back on February the 5th in 1978 at a church out in California called Harvest Christian Fellowship. And I'm going to give you a little bit of what I was like before I'm a Christian. And I don't do that to glorify the sin, but I just think it's important that you understand where I came from. And we have people that live with depraved minds, and I was one of them. I was the chief of sinners. And I just think it's important to understand how God can change a life. I wasn't saved, I was radically saved. A typical day for me as a, back in the day in the 70s was I had gone through probably 3 or 4 different relationships and was in constant upheaval. And a typical day for me I'd start the day out by taking a couple of speed tablets, the double X's we used to call them back in the day. Me and the guys would probably go smoke 3 or 4 joints to get the munchies so that we could go eat. And then that was my pretty much 1 meal a day. And then we would work until the afternoon. And then as soon as we got off, we would all go over where I worked and we would do, I don't know, 4 or 5 lines of cocaine and head off to the bar and shoot pool and be stupid. And then ended up most nights going back to my house. And then we would, at that point is when the serious partying would get going, and we would break out the bong and we would put crushed ice in, pour wine, smoke hash, do magic mushrooms, quaaludes, you name it. I've done it, LSD. I had a doorknob talk to me one time. That's how messed up I was in drugs. I was an alcoholic and I was a full-on drug addict. I grew marijuana in my backyard, and we were selling probably 1 to 2 keys of marijuana in a month, me and a couple of friends of mine, and then probably 1 or 2 jars of speed every week. And again, this was not a full-time occupation, but the money was sure great, but all the money got used up in the drugs that we used. Needless to say, I was a absolute train wreck. My family was scared to death that I was going to die of a drug overdose. And I would tell you that I probably was ripe for that to happen. Enter stage left, Pat Callahan. He was a neighbor of mine at an apartment complex that I lived at. And Pat had gotten saved over at Harvest Christian Fellowship in an outreach with Pastor Greg Laurie. And then Pat was after me to come to church. And I still remember the day that Pat got saved. We all went down to the bar and got smashed because we were lamenting the fact that we had lost another one of our good buddies to the Jesus freaks. So, because that was not the first time that it happened. And so he was coming over and always asking. And finally I said, Pat, if I agree to go, will you leave me alone? And he said, yeah, you just got to go once. He says, if you do that, I'll never say another word. And I said, on your word? And he said, on my word. Okay. So I go down to the Riverside City Coliseum, and we sat there, and I went in, and it's like somebody turned off all the lights and a spotlight was shining on me, and God was saying, Randy Shipman, this is for you. And I sat there for about 45 minutes and listened to everything that Greg said. It's like, how does he know this about me? And he knew exactly what I was. And it wasn't pretty. And the shame came down on me that night to the place where I finally understood that I had to do something different. They did an altar call, and I can't tell you how I got down there, but I know that the next thing I remember, I looked up, and I'm standing in front of the stage looking up at Greg Laurie, and he led us in the sinner's prayer. And I gave my life to Jesus Christ that night. And when I did, it was incredible, the weight that was lifted off of my shoulders, and all of the sin and all of the inability to relate or to have a relationship that meant anything. God just took all that, and he took it and healed it. And I went home that night afterwards. And I remember when afterwards Pat was, hugging me and loving on me and his wife. And I remember telling them, well, I'm not going to give up my marijuana. And they're like, God will do what he needs to do. Don't worry about it. So I went home that night, and I remember just walking in and just looking around. And I owned about probably 5 or 6 different really nice bongs. And I had at the time probably a whole kilo full of marijuana sitting in a bag in the closet. And I had cocaine, I had mescaline, I had just anything you could imagine, LSD. And God just touched me. And I went and I flushed probably $1,000 worth of drugs. And this is back in the 70s. That was a lot of money. $1,000 worth of drugs down the toilet. And I burned up my marijuana in the fireplace. Neighbors probably thought, man, that guy's having one heck of a pot party over there, because it was, I just burned it up. And I just felt like, God, I'm delivered. I don't want this anymore. I don't need this anymore. And I was able to take all of that part of my life and just give it over to the Lord Jesus Christ. The thing that was interesting is that I was growing marijuana in my backyard in the corn. I grew corn, and I had a bunch of it setting out, hanging upside down. You used to go out and spray it with sugar water to get the THC to come down to the tips of the leaves, and then you would harvest it. And that was stuff for personal use. It was too good to sell. But I still remember the day that I had been saved for probably about 3 or 4 weeks. And an officer walked up to me at church. Maybe it's like a month, I guess. And an officer walked up to me at church. And he flashed a badge, and he said, can I talk to you outside? And you have to understand that I was at a place where if I saw a policeman driving down the road, I was panic struck, because I knew that I would be found out. And so he took me outside, and he introduced himself. I don't even remember his name, but he was a detective with the Riverside City Police Department. And he said, I just wanted you to know that probably about, I'm saying a week after I had gotten saved, we had all my buddies that I used to sell drugs with and do drugs with, a bunch of them got arrested. I was shocked that hadn't even come to talk to me, because they should have, obviously. Well, he had pictures to show me of my backyard, of the marijuana, of all the people going in and out of my house that I was selling drugs to. And he told me, he said, I just wanted you to know that the only reason that you didn't get arrested with your friends is because I was there the night that you went forward. And I was shocked when I saw you standing in front of that stage. And he said, and I just wanted you to know that I've been watching you. And I'm like, oh, you know. And then he said, and I still am. So he definitely got my attention. But he said, I see a change in your life. Now, just keep it up. And I did. And I got very involved at the Harvest Church there. It was up on the hill at that point. There was probably only 300 or 400 people attending at that point, maybe 500. We had to move outside, and I would go in early and set up chairs. And then I was there through building the big building, and I was ended up being in charge of the parking lot ministry, which was phenomenal because, you know, we would stand on the roof with binoculars and watch people coming and going, because people would come in and try and steal out of the cars. But what it ended up being was a ministry where we could talk to people that were under the conviction of the Holy Spirit. And as they came out of the church, it gave us a chance to talk to them. And we were blessed to lead quite a number of people to Christ just out there in the parking lot. And, you know, so God used it, you know, and then that went on for a number of years where I ended up going into the sound booth and helping out with sound. I was blessed to be able to just be a very, very active member of that church. I got to go to Israel with Greg Laurie and Mike McIntosh. By the way, they still owe me money. I swallowed a live goldfish on a bet, and they didn't pay me. And then I saw Mike McIntosh about, I guess, 3 or 4 years ago at a men's retreat out here, and he laughed. He remembered me, and he said, "I'll pay you." And I said, "No, I would rather you owed it to me." And we had a good laugh about it, but it was neat. It was just a real blessing. And then from there, I went on to get married and to have 3 kids and live in that area. And then God moved us on into, I got a job as a facilities manager at a hospital. And then in the corporate world, I moved up fairly quickly to an area operations manager, where I traveled several states and went in and did facilities management. And God blessed me in my work because I had a good work ethic and I was honest, and so God could use that. But the thing that I remember the most is I remember the opportunities that God gave me to reach out and minister to my managers and to the people and to the cities that we went to. We were out in Chicago, and I actually helped start the Calvary Chapel out in Schaumburg, Illinois. And a guy out there named Phil Ballmeyer was a great guy, and he and I helped start that church. And then ended up moving back out to Colorado Springs as a district manager over several states out west. And that's where my first wife and I had to part ways, because she had been unfaithful on numerous occasions. And I went to my pastor finally. I said, "When is enough enough?" And he said, "It's enough. You need to move on." And so, and I did. And that's a whole nother story. But then I was single for, I guess, about 2 years. And I hated being single. I couldn't even walk through the mall and see women's clothing. It would just make me furious because I hated being single. And so decided to help start a singles ministry at the Calvary Chapel there in Colorado Springs. And I remember the first night that we all met as a group, I said, this is not an opportunity to meet, girls. This is a singles thing where we lift each other up. And that first night, this cute little blonde came walking in, and I was like, wow, she's nice, right? And so, but I didn't think she would ever in a million years be interested in the likes of me. So this went on for a while, and so she called me, I guess, probably maybe, maybe 6 weeks after we started doing it. And she said, I can't come anymore. And I said, why? And she said, because, there's somebody there that I'm really interested in. And I had this buddy there that I thought that she really liked. And I was crestfallen because I was going to maybe ask her out. And then I asked her, who was it? I said, is it Leo? And she's like, heck no, it's you, dummy. And I was like, what? Really? So I went and bought a dozen yellow roses, and I went right to her house that night. And then we had a whirlwind courtship. And then as I got to know her, I found out that she had living with her 21 kids. And I'm like, 21 kids, and I have 3 of my own. This is crazy. And I'm like, God, are you sure? And God said, yeah, Randy, I'm pretty sure this is the one. And so at the time I had a job where I had to travel pretty much Monday through Friday. I was building hospitals nationwide. And I was going in and building as a owner's representative to hire the general contractor and to do all this stuff with building hospitals. So when I met her and we fell in love, I soon realized that things would have to change. So I walked away from a job, and again, this is back in the early 80s, making a 6-figure income, and to marrying my sweetheart and going off the road. And we opened up 3 group homes in the Colorado Springs area. And we started taking care of orphans. And she had been a foster mom before that. And so we went ahead and started opening up group homes. And it wasn't unusual for us to have, like one Christmas, we had 45 children that we were taking care of. And we specialized with kids with large sibling groups. And we started down that road together. And I went from making over $100,000 a year to pretty much living off the ministry. We just, whatever we took in is what we took in. And so I went from having, great income to practically no income. But it didn't matter because God provided every need. I remember one time where we were extremely tight and we were just waiting for the next series of paychecks to come out, and I was broke, and I was in the bathroom just praying, and then I flipped out some toilet paper, and a $100 bill fell out of the toilet paper on the floor. And it was probably one of our good friends. I don't know if the Lord had an angel do it or one of our friends that maybe knew that things were hard. But that $100 bill came in at just the right time. What I learned in being involved in that ministry, number one, is that we had a lot of kids. My wife Sharon and I, together, we have 7 kids. We adopted 14, and we have 2 other kids that they're our kids. We had one named Antoine that we've raised from 14 all the way up. He's my kid. He calls me. I hear from Antoine every couple months. He calls and talks to me. And so we were blessed to really have 23 kids. And then we currently have 43 grandkids. So needless to say, If ever there was a man that was falling over from a quiver over fulfillment, it was me. One of the things about being involved in group home ministry is you're exposed to a very ugly side of humanity. And we had, we had a young man that was just had issues and nobody could figure out what was wrong with him. And come to find out in serious therapy and working with him and not being willing to give up, we found out that when he was 5 years old, his mom was pimping him out to gay men. And I was just shocked beyond all measure. And then we have a daughter that we adopted. And when she first came with us, she was an absolute train wreck, and she did not trust anybody. And finally, we had a breakthrough. And then we found out why everything was going on. Her father would tie her up and make her dress up in Barbie clothes, and then he would accost her while the mother held her down. And these are things that when you're sitting there with a child and you're having to go through and look at that stuff, it makes you absolutely sick at your stomach. And it made me want to step away from my Christianity for a minute and go take care of business. But what I understand is that God, I don't understand why, but God can even forgive him. God can, it doesn't matter what you've done, God can forgive you. It just takes a repentant heart and a bent knee. And, she came to know Christ. And I was privileged to walk with her down front as she accepted Christ. And many more. We have seen hundreds of kids at this church, a lot, out in Colorado Springs, a lot. When we moved out here, we've just been blessed over the years to be able to expose kids to the truth. It's not always easy. We adopted several kids that that came from very abusive backgrounds. We had a family of 3 children that the oldest girl, ended up having diabetes, and she died about 3 years ago she got involved in drugs. And there's nothing worse for a person that's got type 1 diabetes than to get involved in drugs. And she had been partying, had passed out. When they found her, her blood sugar was up over 1,200 and her core temperature was like in the 80s. And she didn't make it. You see the results of what sin does. Their mom was a prostitute, and we adopted the 3 kids, and probably 3 of the more difficult children we ever adopted. When you sign up to do that, there's not a lot of thanks that comes with it. There's a lot of judgment that comes from people that don't understand what you're dealing with these kind of children. And you get judged a lot because they just don't understand everything that's really going on. But what I learned is if I'm doing it for man and I'm doing it to get attention, then I'm doing it for the wrong reason. This was a struggle for me to even come and talk to you today. There's a guy here in town called Halloran Hilton Hill, and he had asked me numerous times to come on his radio program and talk about the group home. And I always refused. And he kept asking me, why won't you do it? And I said, because I want the attention to be on Jesus Christ and not me or my wife. And so this for me is a step to even be willing to do this, because I don't want anything that we've been through. I don't want to glorify myself or my wife in any fashion. Anything that we have done because we wanted to be obedient to Christ. And it hasn't been easy. Watching these kids suffer for the things that they've gone through, There's hard times, and then there are the times where you see the kids that you don't think have got a chance. And they come back and they accept Christ, and you see what God can do in a life. And he does. So we've been blessed. We've had the opposite side of it too. But through it all, what God has taught us is he's taught us that he can do all things through Christ who strengthens us. And if you're trying to do it in your own strength, I don't care what you're doing in life, stop. Give it to the Lord. Allow him, through his Holy Spirit, to come inside of you, being filled with the Spirit, just allowing him to give you the ability to minister in places where you didn't think you could. We got out of the group home business because, quite frankly, they changed around how we used to specialize with large sibling groups, and they started to change the model around, and then they wanted us to become a reformatorium. In other words, they wanted us to take criminals, kids that needed to be in the juvenile justice system, and they were coming in and beating up our kids that needed help. And so we ended up deciding not to do that, but we continued to foster. So we stopped running a group home, but then we continued to do foster care, which is how we ended up with our last three. You know, I'm 69 and I've got an 11-year-old. And I've got a 14-year-old and I've got a 15-year-old at home. And then from there all the way up into almost 50 years old, we got kids almost every year in between. God has continued to use us, and he does it in different ways. And you can't paint yourself into a corner for the ways that God can use you. Because of my ability to build things, and because of my, used to be a general contractor, he uses me now to help out with the widows and the orphans. We get to go out and we get to help people that need help. And again, I'm kind of like blessed because I've got a wife that supports me in that, and she allows me to do that. We also homeschool our kids because, it's very difficult. I watch what comes out of public school, and it's not usually very good. If there's good parents at home and they have stuff that's the way that it should be, it can work. But I've just seen so many failures with kids that go and get involved into drugs, into pornography, for us, something we learned a long time ago is we've raised a lot of kids. I've never once given a teenager a phone. I've never once bought a car for a child. I helped them get jobs, and I drove them back and forth, and they earned money, and they had money for insurance, purchased their own car. We have a young man named Antoine. Antoine was 14 years old when he came in my house. Antoine was about 6 foot tall, about 250 pounds. And he had been in multiple homes. Nobody could handle him. And so when they brought him in, he looks at me and he's like big and bad. And I told him I needed to talk to him, so I went in the boys' room and I closed the door. And I looked at him, he's just a 14-year-old. And I jumped right on top of him and I started tickling him. And he was like, "Fool, what is wrong with you," right? I mean, just took him up one side, down the other. And then he said, "Why are you doing this?" And I says, "Because you're a kid. Act like it. You have my permission to be a child." And he turned out to be one of the best children I ever raised. And we went through this where he went all the way with us from 14 years old up into college. He ended up being a all-city football player. We used to love to go watch him play football because he was so big, you could see the kids flying in the air off the line as he was going through. So he led the season in tackles. He led the season in pancakes. I mean, you name it, he got it. I remember when he got his car, and he had an accident on the way to school. There were leaves on the road and it had been raining. And he slid into the back with one of his teachers, believe it or not, and he totaled his car. And I remember going up there, the police called me and said, you need to come down here. And I remember walking up and looking at him, and he thought I was going to kill him. And I walked up and I looked at him, he looked at me, and I said, come here. And I gave him the biggest hug, and I said, dude, I am so sorry. He busted down and cried in my arms like a little baby because he knew I loved him. And that's like Jesus' unconditional love for us. He's a father that loves us. He loves you. And it's no different that we should not have that in our heart for people that we come into contact with. So me and Antoine are and have been since the day he walked in the house, and he's now a young man. I count his daughter as my granddaughter, and we tried to adopt him. It didn't work out because his parents didn't want it, but as soon as they pulled off the adoption option, they're like, yeah, you can finish raising him, we just don't want you to adopt him. So we ended up finishing raising him, but when he calls me, he doesn't call me Randy, he calls me Dad. And that's a blessing. I could tell you story after story after story of the different kids that God has blessed us with over the years and how he's used us in ways that I find, quite frankly, unimaginable. I mean, just unimaginable. There are just too many stories to tell. If I was going to write a book, it would be entitled Yours, Mine, and Everybody Else's, because, it's been an interesting life. We've really been blessed to be able to be used by God in that fashion. We were fortunate when we came out here, we got to help start this church. We've been here pretty much from, I think the church was two years old when we started coming here, and so we've been blessed to be involved here at the Calvary Chapel in Knoxville, and man, have we got a great pastor. We have been so blessed to have Pastor Mark as our pastor. And I guess in closing, I would say to those of you that are wondering, can God use me? And I can tell you that God can use anybody. He used Balaam to listen to a donkey, of all things. And you can be used by God, but all it takes is the ability to be willing to put your own desires and your own needs on hold and say, God, what would you have me do? You may not think that you can do it. And in your own strength, you'll be correct, it's impossible. But with Jesus Christ's help, there isn't anything that you can't accomplish. Anybody that tells you you can't, that's their issue, and they need to go talk to God about it. You need to go talk to God about what he would ask you to do. And then you should be willing to step out in faith and allow him to use you in ways that you can't even begin to imagine. I have been blessed to have come out of a life of, when your family is scared to death that you're going to die of an overdose, and then you come out on the other side and they're like, I turned into an absolute, Jesus freak, and God totally turned my life 100% around. But it wasn't anything that I did, it was everything that Jesus did. And when you recognize the fact that Christ, through a willing heart, can do anything, there's nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, that you can't do if you do it as unto the Lord and you allow him through his Holy Spirit to lead you. And then lastly, and this is the most difficult part, it's called obedience, and it's called a bent knee. Unless you're willing to surrender to what God intends for you to do, don't do it, because it won't work. You have to be surrendered, and you have to be willing to do what God wants you to do, which means you got to listen and you got to follow through on what he's asking you to do. So when I was a young man, I grew up as a Mormon, and I used to go to church dutifully every Sunday. They would give us the tithing envelopes. So I'd go out in the neighborhood and collect tithe for the church, because a lot of Mormons don't go to church, so they bring the tithing envelope to their house. And but I was struggling, because when I was in high school, when I was like a freshman in high school, back then in the late 60s, Mormons thought that black people were going to hell. I had a class that I went to, and the teacher was talking about the American black man going to hell. And I struggled with that notion, because a lot of my best friends growing up were black kids, and I lived in a not very nice neighborhood. A lot of my best friends were black kids. And I told him, I said, I don't think God sees color. And he said, you idiot. He said, that's in the Constitution, it's not in the Bible. And I looked at him and I just said, this is not for me. And I got up and I walked out of that church. And much to the chagrin of my father, because, I was supposed to be there and I wasn't. And I left and I never went back. Matter of fact, I've been excommunicated twice, because in Mormonism, they do baptism for the dead, and then they start showing back up with the elders and stuff to try and convert you back to the Mormon faith. And I had led some of their guys to Christ, and so they weren't happy with me. I've got a nice Ryrie study Bible, and I've got my section for Jehovah's Witnesses, and I've got my sections for Mormons. And when they come knocking on the door wanting to come in, I'm like, by all means, can I give you a cookie? I would love to talk to you. And so I learned, pretty early that you love them into the kingdom, you don't beat them over the head. But I went from Mormonism to heathenism, and that's how God finally came through heathenism to being a Christian, because I left Mormonism to get away from they were just prejudiced beyond imagination, and I just couldn't abide it. What you could pray for would be because of the dynamics of our ministry, we have at times family things that come up. Pray for me, pray for my wife, pray for my family, that we would be all in unity, and that God could go through. And I've got a young son that many people have put out at the curb. His name's Caleb. And Caleb was one of my most difficult children that we ever raised. And I want you to pray for Caleb, because if anybody's ever heard the truth, it's Caleb, and he's been in and out of prison. And yet, out of all my kids, he's the one that comes to visit us the most. And he loves his mama dearly, but we talk to him about what's real and about what God intends to do. And he's of the opinion that, well, I'm going to be a post-rapture kid. And I can't convince him that, dude, you don't want to be a post-rapture kid. So pray for Caleb. That's what you could pray for us.